Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Uh, Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Gunjan Jain, and I work with Climate Trends. We are here to have a discussion today about the upcoming UNFCCC COP28 and what are the major discussion points and narrative points which we expect to kind of keep an eye out for this year, especially from the perspective of India and the Global South, and what are the emerging narratives that as journalists would be useful for you to kind of understand and write more about, and where the nuances and the sort of the discussion points ultimately lie. But we have quite a few journalists who've joined us online as well, and of course welcome to all of you who are here, and to all our esteemed panelists as well as our participants. If I may invite my colleague Aarti Khosla here to give an introduction and set the context. Aarti.
Thanks very much. I will jump straight. This is a group who knows each other, so we don't need many introductions. But this is, and welcome Professor Avinash Prasad. Thank you for joining us, and welcome all the participants who are also online. As Gunjan said, there is outcomes that happened at the Delhi Declaration and the G20 outcomes, which spoke a lot about India's new renewed position in the global south. That was also the first time we heard political statements about tripling of renewable energy, as well as lines on what a climate finance number could look like. And from that time to now, the international politics has changed quite a lot, not just because of the evolving Middle East situation, but also because the how the discussions around what the energy mix should be, what the outcome of the COP should be on issues which become far more contentious, like fossil fuel language, is becoming a lot more being watched out for. We don't know where this will land, but there are several and many issues at this COP which kind of intersect at a very unique place. Of course, given that this is the year where a global stocktake needs to happen, which was agreed at the time of the Paris Agreement, that there will be an evaluation on how far we are from achieving our goals. That will be the biggest discussion at this COP, to be able to land a good outcome of the global stocktake. But combined with that as well is some kind of an indication that there is practical action that is possible on climate. Especially this room is full of journalists who have been veterans of writing and following the COP. But it's quite important, at least in the phase that we are in right now, to talk a little more about practical action, not just about things that have been agreed in terms of long-term pathways. There is as well the need to send right signals on the just energy transition and the implications of that. Last year at about the same time, there was quite a busy discussion on how a good JETP for India could look like. For various reasons, a JETP hasn't landed, but the importance and primacy of just transition as an actual policy measure that will bring a different or a changed social contract has definitely landed. It'll be nice to discuss also at this session over the next hour or so on what the JETP actually means. If you thrash out the Indonesian JETP and the South African JETP, then it's quite clear that a JETP is essentially a way to keep the political salience of transition from coal to clean alive. It is very hard for a country to actually retire coal power plants. As we see in the Indonesian JETP, about 1.7 gigawatts by 2035 have to be retired as written in the JETP, and actually is less than how much Indonesia would have done business as usual. And the amount of money that is attached to it is 1.3 billion. So that's the mechanics of how things get committed at the international level. When you do all the talk and you actually deliver some decision, which is a JETP decision, the bar is far lower than where it would have been even when countries themselves voluntarily take action. So really, I think a case also has to be made, especially in the situation that India is in, to make sure that there is ramping up as much of renewables, and there is not always that juxtaposition of coal versus renewables. It seems that we don't need that right now, but there are other useful arguments and analysis to show how the renewables space up, and whether it's combined with battery or not will actually make the case. But that's only one aspect of the whole story, and there will be several views on how to break that up. One other issue that repeatedly, if you hear the COP presidency, ad hoc chairman, who is also the president designate of the UNF of the COP, Sultan Al Jaber, is often making that statement, which is about making sure that there is emission reduction. And the green campaigners and the climate campaigners often talk about reducing fossil sources or fossil fuels, meaning coal, oil, and gas. So you reduce the fuel and not just reduce the sources. That is not devoid of its own share of how technology and fixes which are considered as clean and green will have a massive and big role to play into what the issues will be on just making sure that emission sources, the emissions are reduced and the sources remain as such. Those who are knowledgeable about this can speak more than me, but there is a lot of room then for technological fixes like carbon capture and sequestration, which probably solve 5 to 7% of the problem in the world, but not the less, and not the rest. And there is a need to show that there is a room for this kind of technology, but only a limited room, and it's not a panacea for some kind of a success on climate action. This is essentially the issues that we wanted to discuss today. Like I said, the point about energy transition, when the Glasgow COP ended, there was huge dramatics on what a phase down language means versus a phase out language. India and China blamed for having pushed the COP decision towards a phase down language. But if you see right now, given the energy security issues, given how there are difficulties even with US and EU to talk about phasing out of gas from their mix, there has been a resurgence on looking at gas, but definitely sometimes also coal. This is not permanent, and there are several and many studies which suggest that there is possibilities of looking at a strong outcome, but it looks like maybe the landing places or where the middle ground is for the phase out language at the COP, at this COP, needs to be navigated a bit. It will be nice to hear from our panelists on what they think the relevance of that phase out of fossil fuel language is, because technically it must necessarily go along with the tripling of renewables. The Delhi Declaration spoke about the tripling of renewables, but really did not address the former. And like I said, there is a role of CCS there as well. There is a big role of oil companies and how they are framing the transition, including the COP president and several big oil companies. There is huge belief that they have in climate action being needed and climate change being real, but what they are proposing in terms of climate action is still limited to a lot of technology and not really to big economy-wide reductions that will solve the crisis even in the near future. There is massive discussions on finance. If anything, this COP could be a finance COP. We have Professor Prasad here, who will speak more on outcomes that have been the highlight of the loss and damage transitional committee meetings. There have been decisions that have been taken for some period to house that fund into the World Bank. Does it still have any money in it or not? And leave aside that, the OECD report, which came about 2 days back, spoke as well about data not being released yet, but the 100 billion having been achieved. I wasn't able to wrap my head around that, but perhaps we can discuss in the panel on whether that magic figure of 100 billion, are we well past it? But we are certainly well past it in the narrative, because we have moved the debate from the billions to shifting the trillions as such. There is implications of the recently concluded meetings between the premiers of US and China. If you read the joint statement, then there are lines on energy transition, on circular economy, on even methane, and there is a belief that there is some kind of a joint partnership on having a target for methane reduction that will happen between the US or China, or has happened. So whether or not it will translate to other countries also being forced to look at methane reduction is not the similar thing as carbon dioxide reduction. There are better people to explain this than me, but this will only be additional and not a substitute as such, as I understand, very simply put. But one thing in that US-China joint statement was China's agreement for the first time, I believe, to put economy-wide NDCs by 2035, which is significant. How it means to just China's first understanding of peaking, then to take absolute emission reductions within this century to further reduce emissions, and then to commit to a 2035 economy-wide NDC. And last of all, especially those who are writing and filing about it, as you have written yourself or you have seen, there is going to be huge debate about an oil company hosting the COP. The writing is on the wall pretty much in terms of what it means. It is still going to be a glossy affair. At the end of it, it will, as every COP, it will have its own share of successes and failures. And we can only hope at this COP the share of successes is more. All said and done, there is a lot of attempt for the first time also for the oil and gas companies of the world to come with proposals which are looking attractive. And the questions to ask are they really that much attractive as they are being pitched, or what the reality is? There is something called the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Accelerator. What we've heard is that this might be launched at the COP and eventually will bring a lot of oil and gas companies from across the world, not just to make a certain commitment to reduce emissions, but also to be able to deploy more and newer technology to tackle those emissions, whatever the details will be. In summation, I think this COP really looks quite different from others. The Glasgow COP 2 years back was a moment in which the world announced net zero. It all looked like we've entered a pinnacle of ambition, with every country committing to a net zero target. But as you try and open the box, the devil is in the details. We will try and unpack it in the next hour or so. Two panels for us today. The first panel is being moderated by my colleague Archana. She will explain what she'd like, and the second panel is also being moderated by my other colleague Mayank, who will also explain how he wants to have a discussion on the aspect of decarbonization and energy transition. I will pause now and hand it back to Gunjan, and I wanted to ask if Professor Prasad has to speak now or in the panel, or would you? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Aarti, and thank you, everyone. We have Professor Prasad who has joined us online, and I think I can invite my colleague Archana to be here and invite the panel. We have Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi and Srishan Venkatesh, who's the editorial head for Carbon Copy, both joining us.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Prasad. It's a pleasure meeting you, meeting you. Welcome, Vaibhav, and thanks so much for joining us, Srishan. So the first session that we planned today is basically to talk about the dynamics of climate, energy, given the current geopolitical situation. Since the last COP, we've seen many things change on the world stage. There is the global stocktake report findings were almost drowned by what happened in the Middle East. The conflict in Palestine has kind of overshadowed a lot of other news events and important events that have been happening climate-wise. And we're wondering if the idea today is to kind of put into context all that has happened since the last COP and how those events are going to now affect the discussions here. And I'd like to start with Professor Avinash Prasad, who is the Emeritus Professor at Gresham College and Special Envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados on investments and financial services. So if I can start with you, if you could talk a little bit about the Global South concerns, given that you are the architect of the Bridgetown Initiative. And last week we saw India host a summit on the Voice of Global South Summit. And we've also seen concerns that the Global South have been raising in the G20 summit that India hosted. Will these concerns reverberate in the COP discussions, and in what ways do you think?
Well, good morning from Barbados, where dawn is just breaking. It's a pleasure to be with you. These are big questions, and one of the roles I played this year that has brought me great insight and very relevant to this discussion is as a negotiator in the Transition Committee on behalf of developing countries for the Loss and Damage Fund. It's called the TC, Transition Committee. There are 24 negotiators, 12 developed from developed countries, 12 from developing. And we reached an agreement in our fifth session in Abu Dhabi just a couple of weeks ago. And that agreement is going to be taken to COP on the Loss and Damage Fund. So if you remember last year at Sharm el-Sheikh, they agreed to establish a fund and they agreed to set up this negotiating committee to operationalize the fund. And we've come up with some recommendations which will be put to the COP ministers, which we hope will be accepted, which will operationalize a loss and damage fund. But let me step back a little bit. The global stocktake is both important and not important. It's important because we need to make an assessment of where we are as an important part of the process. But we know where we are. There's going to be nothing from the result of the global stocktake that everybody doesn't already know, which is that we are way behind and off track on mitigation, adaptation, and even with this new fund on funding for loss and damage. So I do find it's perhaps worth just pointing out, because I think in the past couple of years, there's been a real separation of mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. But before then, people kind of merged these three into one. In fact, when I first arrived in this area, this topic, it seemed like there was a word called mitigation adaptation. But the two are very, very different things. And you know they're different things because you fund them differently. And I would say that's the other big thing that's happened in the past 12, 18 months. There's a realization that the reason why the global stocktake is where it is, the reason why we are so far behind, is not because there is a misunderstanding about climate. It is not because people don't get the science. It's not because we don't have the tech. We have all the technology we need today. With solar and hydro and wind, we have all the tech we need. We don't need new tech. The problem is finance. The problem is the absence of finance. And that's a particular problem in the global south, as you mentioned, because the cost of money in the global south is very expensive compared to the global north. You're going to talk about renewables and decarbonization. There's great work done by IRENA and IEA and others, which shows that for the cost of capital for a solar farm. In other words, how much money do you got to pay investors for them to invest in the solar farm? It's about 4% in Germany. It's about 9% in India. And it's about 14% in South Africa, 20% in Zambia. So that's why the money is not going to the global south. It's not that people don't get it. It's that you can't make it profitable at that cost of capital. China is an exception because it's one of, in so many ways, of course, but it's a developing country with a developed country cost of capital. The cost of capital in China is as high as as low as in Germany. So let me try and come to some conclusion. We have, mitigation is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation is about what happens when you don't mitigate enough. And mitigation has all kinds of revenues. Solar farms, hydroelectric, wind turbines, they make money. Adaptation is about stuff that doesn't make money. It's stronger seawalls. It is better drainage and flood systems. And that's why we need the public sector involvement. Loss and damage is what happens when you haven't mitigated, you haven't adapted, and now you've got an actual event of loss and damage. And for that, there are no savings, there's no revenues. You actually need public finance. What are we going to see at COP? The loss and damage fund will go to the transition, go to the ministers. Yes, there's going to be pledges. There'll be pledges. The pledges may get up between 500 million to $1 billion. People will say, "Oh my lord, this is so tiny." That's not that money is the startup money. It is not the money for the entire fund. The entire fund needs to be closer to 100 billion than 1 billion. But that requires a financing plan. That requires champions who will go out and push for new innovative financial sources. We'll never get a loss and damage fund financed by rich country budgets. Rich country budgets for aid, they're not going up, they're shrinking. They're double counting, they're reclassifying. That's why this $100 billion is also not of particular interest to me, because as you said, it's way now out of date. We now know we need $2.4 trillion per year in developing countries. And that 100 billion, they've got there by reclassifying a lot of existing lending. Every development bank in the world has suddenly become a climate bank. And they're starting to say everything they do, all the things they would have done anyway, is really climate finance. And so they're including that in these numbers. It's good that they've hit a promise, but it's not going to make any difference. So the Loss and Damage Fund, I think it's a very important historic event. We've been debating it for 10, 15 years, sometimes longer. We now have a fund. We have an operational basis. What does hosting in the World Bank mean? It's not a World Bank fund. It's not World Bank money. It's that there's a World Bank trustee, and there's a World Bank banker, and there's a World Bank secretariat. But the money is the fund's money. The board is the fund's board. And they can set their own eligibility, their own rules, who gets it, who doesn't. And so I think where it's hosted is not a major issue, except that it's important that rich countries, they have a real visceral fear of giving money to poor countries. And the worst thing is giving money to poor countries in a new system, a new structure, a new institution. So telling them that they can do it via the World Bank actually makes them slightly more comfortable. But it doesn't actually change very much about the fund. So on mitigation, what happens every year is rich countries come and they say to poor countries, you need to be more ambitious. And indeed, ambition is a problem. However, for the Global South, the Global South is now emitting 63% of all emissions. We're a tiny part of the stock of emissions in the atmosphere that's caused global warming. But if we're going to solve global warming, we've got to play center place, because 63% of current emissions, and that's only rising sharply. You talked about phase down and phase out. It's almost the wrong sort of issue. The real issue is there is a massive increase of energy need coming from the Global South. Massive. If that is in fossil fuels, we have a real problem. So let's focus. If all we did was make sure that any new facility was renewable energy based, we'd have a huge impact. Phasing down is economically costly, as in I think you used the phrase, retiring. Retiring is not only economically costly, it is socially costly. We've got communities in South Africa, coal mines that will close those communities. Let's make sure that all future demand is in renewables. Let's get that going, and then we can phase down and phase out much more easily. So we're going to get ambition, but ambition without finance is empty ambition. Forcing countries to be ambitious and have NDCs is meaningless if you don't give them the money to do it. Now, on mitigation, because the world doesn't have much money, on mitigation, we need private sector money. We need to unblock private sector money by reducing the cost of capital in our countries. The cost of capital is high because of the international financial system, which makes our currencies more volatile, and we have less ways of safeguarding. We don't have a Federal Reserve that can print dollars. We print our currency, but it doesn't have a global demand. The final thing I would say is adaptation. So we've managed over the past few years to really raise the profile of adaptation. And adaptation is key to the global south. Yes, we need to mitigate, but because the world has not mitigated, because of where we are suffering substantial losses. Between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, which India is most of India is between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. Loss and damage for climate change is 4 times greater than anywhere else. So we need to adapt. Now, the G20 under N.K. Singh and Larry Summers' committee talked about a tripling of money for the MDBs. And the way that the multilateral development banks, the way that connects to climate is that because adaptation doesn't raise revenue, you need public finance. And there's no point being resilient today, resilient in 20 years' time. We're going to be resilient today. So we're going to borrow huge amounts of money. That money has to be long-term and low cost. Otherwise, we can't afford it. That's what that tripling is about. Triple the MDBs, let them focus on resilience building, and that connects with climate. So let me end there and invite your questions and thoughts, and keen to hear the other panelists.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. That was extremely well articulated, and it does make it very amply clear that this COP, although all COPs are ultimately about finance, this COP, more than others, is going to be talking about what matters most, which is the flow of money and how we are going to change our systems, our energy systems. My next question is going to be to Vaibhav, who is a fellow at CEEW in Delhi. And Vaibhav, if you could talk to us a little bit about, Professor Prasad has brought us up to date on the events that have happened related to climate finance, the discussions that might take center stage at the COP. As far as energy is concerned, we've seen how the Ukraine war changed the energy dynamics in the developed world. And now the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict, that is threatening also the region's stability, but energy markets. How are you reading the situation, and how do you see this affecting not just discussions at the COP, but going forward?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. Very good afternoon to all the colleagues here. I think the war is definitely, it will weigh very heavily because it is in that region. And it's a very important, very big geopolitical event. So there undoubtedly it will be at the back of minds of most of the decision makers because it is developing by the day. That is all. It's not that we will be able to predict. There is some kind of certainty. It's not that at all. It is kind of developing by the day. So that is, as more information comes in and developments happen, of course, it's a very uncertain future for that particular region. So yes, I mean, that's a given backdrop, but I'll focus on the COP part of it. I think the first point I want to make, these discussions are very important, and COPs, each COP is important, but I mean, COP is also kind of in some way continuous process. No one COP kind of will hit the ball out of the park on all aspects. It's a collective thing that happens across years. Still, the big difference about this particular COP is that this is a GST COP. So of course, operationally, finance is a big deal, but this is a GST COP in terms of the processes established under the Paris Agreement. A process we all must know. What is the process of GST? It will happen every 5 years for 2 years. That's the process of GST. There are 3 phases. There's first is the information collection phase, technical assessment phase, and the political phase. There are 3 phases, right? That is all about the process of this GST process. The motivation, to understand the motivation is very important. Like, why was this even inserted in the Paris Agreement? The motivation was that this will be a formal point for the whole world to reflect and take stock for ratcheting up of ambition. And I think that is the key word. That is the motivation behind COP. It is not just for taking stock. It is a formal process for collective reflection and ratcheting up ambition, right? So that is going to be heavy on the way this COP will be sort of evaluated. Of course, every COP we have this gap report, emission gap report. So we know progress is happening or not. But this COP is that formal thing in the process. It will evaluate it because it is a GST COP, and this GST COP is expected to happen every 5 years, right? So that is one big thing I want to talk about, like for this particular COP perspective. Coming to the presidency, now every presidency, I think, because it is so the negotiation is so complicated, I think every presidency does not think about what will make this a successful COP. I think the way they think about it, what will be good enough to showcase this as a successful COP? Like what is that good enough thing, right? And from that perspective, what is good enough for this COP? That's how the presidency, because the war, of course, is a big kind of backdrop of this particular COP. So what is good enough, is from this GST perspective, in some way, have we kind of enhanced ambition? That is how it definitely will be evaluated. And from the ambition perspective, it is not just going to be about now ambition enhancement. Finance is a big thing. And numbers, both loss and damage finance plus mitigation finance. In some way, if some ambition, we show some ambition has been enhanced on those fronts, I think that is what also the developing world has been wanting for so long. The other thing that we have kind of taken for granted is the tripling of RE, because G20 declaration, I've kind of adopted it. I'm not sure that should we take this for granted. I mean, if all the 190 plus countries agree, it is a great thing, but we should never take these things for granted, because there are other 170 plus countries who have not really weighed in on this subject. And what we have seen during this negotiation process, many countries actually, the capabilities are so low of developing South that they don't understand, like it's not so easy for them to understand the implications of any such big things for their country. It is not so straightforward. So we are expecting that tripling of RE will formally come into the COP text. I hope it does. But some effort will need to happen for that also. It is nothing is taken for granted just because it happened in G20. But that is one thing. If that happens, definitely presidency will say that this is something, because it is not G20. I mean, this is something that happened this COP. All countries have agreed. So this is definitely something that is an ambitious and kind of success for this COP. Second success is clearly this operationalization. So the way the climate debate is evolving, a lot of strands, because now it has become so mainstream. It is not just we discuss in Bonn and in the COPs. There's so many things that are discussed outside, be it G20 platform, be it the other finance channel that Professor Prasad was talking about, which are now reflected. Now they are brought into COP, because the time is so short. We can't wait for 6 months for these like 15-day, 20-day discussions. Discussions are perennial now on so many different issues on climate. And then they're brought into these negotiations the moment, there's some great kind of better progress in it. So yes, finance, I do hope operationalization of finance happens. That will be another, you could say, positive step, to showcase success, because that's what all of us want. It's not just about the presidency. I think showcasing success is important for every country, especially in this GST COP. So, and even in Glasgow, let's say the first day, the net zero announcement, the message was that countries are ratcheting up ambition. It's a great thing. The last day, whatever happened, I don't think it happened because countries were pulling each other at all. That phased out versus phased down controversy that happened, it was definitely kind of more pulled in by the Western media, right? It was not at all that countries were in a very big way kind of pushing each other, because naming and shaming is broadly out of the game now at the country level. At the country level, earlier naming and shaming used to happen in a very big way. Now most countries have realized that these naming and shaming doesn't really help the cause at all. We have to showcase trust and kind of some cooperation at that level. That doesn't happen. But yes, of course, Western media tries to pull these things many times. So that's why this controversy happened. But otherwise, the world, every COP, all countries do try to show that we have this process is kind of a trustworthy process. There is trust, there's cooperation, and that's what we want to showcase. So it's an interest of all the countries, not just the presidency, to show kind of some progress. And hopefully we'll show this we'll see this in tripling of RE. We'll see this in operationalization of this finance thing. I think who pays is going to be another. So if you look at the kind of collection of COP, so to speak, there will be some, like many old issues which are being carried forward. And there are new tussles that are kind of introduced. Because as we progress in each strand, at some points there's kind of convergence and cooperation. But then the moment you solve it, it's not the final solution. Right? Nothing is a final solution. There's a loss and damage fund. We have made progress on two things. It's not the final thing. The final thing is only when some meaningful finance is delivered to developing or vulnerable countries. That's the final outcome on ground. To achieve that outcome on ground, there were many, many things that will need to happen. Many stages need to be crossed. Some stages there will be convergence. Some stages there will be very big tussles. So the biggest tussle on that is who will pay. That tussle is just, we saw, some shades of it in the last COP also. That is going to be, I think, for the next few COPs till it is resolved. I don't even know how it will be resolved. This who pays question for the loss and damage fund. And that is going to be probably emerge as a one big sticking point, in this particular COP. And yes, another new thing that is now new negotiation kind of tussle that is being opened up is about this methane pledge. That is a new thing. So who pays is going to be one big thing. Methane pledge. It does appear that if US and China announcement is already out, it clearly will put a lot of pressure on many other countries to understand. And as I said, these are new, kind of directions that are open in the formal process. Of course, methane has been in debate, academic debate for long, but now formally you introduce in a big way in the negotiation process. It is always there in larger GHGs and all that. But the moment is like, the question is it being positioned as a big issue in this COP, something like that, So if that is what happens, then it is a new direction of big kind of hard negotiation that is opened, and many countries will have to. That doesn't mean that every country will agree to the methane pledge. I don't think anybody expects that suddenly that will happen. That definitely means that many countries will be forced to start looking internally at where do they stand on methane. Like what are the big sectors, what is the information, what does it really mean for them to mitigate methane emissions. So they will be forced to take stock, they will be forced to collect information, better understand, try to figure out what does it mean if they sign on to the pledge, what does it mean for their economies and all, right? India, for example, has very clearly said officially that agricultural sector is out of our NDC or any emissions pledge, because it is such a complicated sector for us, right? So it is out of it. But in India's largest methane emissions, it comes from the livestock sector, I think 60% plus. Then it is rice. So a very complicated sector for us to deal with. So of course we are not going to sign. It is hard for me to expect India to sign on to the methane pledge. Last year also there were some murmurs around it. But if it happens in a big way, then one will be forced to look at many, many things, right? And eventually, maybe 3, 4, 5 years down the line, one could see that this becomes a very big sticking point, the way loss and damage has been till now. So a new channel has been opened that is also kind of very, very clear in this COP, which is methane. Second is who pays. These are going to be two tussle points. Finally, unfortunately, what we are seeing that equity and CBDR are kind of continuously being eroded in that sense. And this carbon space debate, India will continue to push for it. I'm not even sure that are there many countries which are also talking on the similar lines? Many. I'm not actually sure about it. It's a very important point, but it's not just about carbon space, it's about development. That's the bottom line, right? That carbon space should be available for development. That is our kind of position. It's a very important position. It's unclear to me that has India got a big support from many other nations on this front. So we do keep on kind of positioning this point because this is a very important point to be made. But somehow equity and CBDR are being neglected. Even though we are continuously highlighting this, operationally nothing is changing, unfortunately. So let's see what happens on those two principles. Well, we can see India talking about it. India talking about unfulfilled pre-2020 promises. That is also what India is going to definitely be talking about. We are going to talk about meaningful delivery of finance. not just on loss and damage, but also on mitigation. That has been a continuous agenda. So those are few things that kind of we'll continue to be talking about, and there's some other things that developed world will continue to talk about, like the methane pledge and so on.
Excellent. Thank you, Vaibhav. So we are going to see India try and navigate for more continue to push for more carbon space and development. You said we've also talked about how discussions on finance and are going to affect, and in energy, how tripling of RE might be one of the major issues. Along with this, it's really nice that you mentioned methane cuts, because that is something that I intended to try and understand a little bit more from this panel. I'll come to you, Srishan, because as editor of Carbon Copy, you've been looking at these issues very closely, and it'll be great if you could talk a little bit about how these conversations around methane pledges, and not just methane pledges, but other conversations that we're seeing in energy. For instance, gas being pushed as a bridge fuel. Also, the push now for SMRs, nuclear reactors. How are you seeing this space being navigated by countries like India and other global South countries? And how big an issue is it going to be in this COP?
Thanks, Archana, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us. So, first on the methane pledge itself, I think, like Vaibhav very rightly pointed out, it's about building narratives, right? Building on what's happened in the past. And we've seen that in the last couple of years, particularly, methane has opened up as one of those avenues. Since the time, there was this whole debate about how GHGs are going to be brought into the fold, how the discussion needs to move beyond just talking about CO2. And although the methane pledge gained quite a bit of traction, gained quite a bit of attention, was also the kind of the narrative that brought about the agreement between the US and China, which to many people at the time, it was sort of like the saving grace of COP26. And we've seen that China has kind of made their move, has prepared an action plan. Although from what I can make out so far, the action plan doesn't have any timelines or targets or anything like that, which is a requirement of the methane pledge, so to say. So there's still a gap there to be bridged. All the points that Vaibhav mentioned about why there's conventionally not been a convenient subject for India. The political economy of agriculture is way too complicated, way too difficult to kind of try to insert methane as a subject to control into it. Plus, a lot of our sources of methane are very distributed sources. They're not concentrated sources that are seen in other oil and gas economies, where production and extraction itself has a huge methane footprint. So I would actually side with what Vaibhav said, that this is, if it does become a big narrative this year, then it is going to push, although there's going to be a lot of resistance to kind of accepting it right at the get-go, it's going to push countries towards, or it's going to make it clear that at some point in the future, it's going to be no longer possible to ignore this or possible to push this under the rug. So even for countries like India, we'll have to start looking at the sectors that are easy to address when it comes to methane and so on, and gradually get to a place where we can have some kind of plan to address methane. On the other question of technologies in general adding to this this new energy economy or energy transition, this momentum for energy transition itself, I think more and more it's becoming clear that a new energy economy is not going to be a simple transition from one technology to another. It's going to be a story of diversification as well. There are going to be, the toolbox has a lot of tools. Each is not going to be suitable for every use case. So there is going to be a lot of selective usage of technologies for certain use cases. The challenge though is, how are these going to compete with each other? How are they going to find their suitable use? and so on. And like particularly for India, we were recently looking at how this resurgence of nuclear power, what role it will play in a future energy mix for India, what role it can potentially play, and renewable energy, of course, is the mainstay of energy transition. But even if we look at meeting the full potential for capacity of all renewables in the country, solar, wind, and hydro, we still won't be near, meeting our projected energy demand for the future. Particularly if we want to get to some level of equity in terms of energy demand with the global average. And that kind of illustrates the point that we need to diversify, expand our sources as well. Of course, the viability of this and nuclear or CCS or any kind of energy storage technology, whatever it is, will have to be like a dynamic process. So there will be a market factor. There will be a market that will play a very huge role in determining what these ultimately these sources are. But at this point, it's fairly foolish to suggest that we should give up on any source. There are a lot of nascent technologies, lots happening to kind of improve conversion factors, improve utilization factors inside these technologies. So improve material efficiencies. So it doesn't make sense for India to kind of step back from it. Yeah, I'll just stop there.
Thanks so much. So basically talking about energy transition brings me back to the main point that we were making, that the COP is going to be, finance is going to be at the center of this, finance discussions are going to be at the center of this COP. And I'd like to go back to Professor Prasad. And Professor Prasad, if I may come back to your Bridgetown initiative and the suggestions that were being made and the discussions that were going on also about how to make finance available at cheaper rates for developing countries, relooking at SDRs and relooking at more robust MDB reforms. How much of that is going to be a part of this COP, you think, and what can we expect?
Thank you. I do think it will be an important part of the COP. I've been involved in a group that is looking at some of the leadership declarations who are here from COP, and finance will be quite central to that. Let me just pick up one thing to clarify. It was mentioned a couple of times amongst the panelists, operationalizing. Of course, operationalizing is just a loss and damage fund. It's not about mitigation and adaptation. And of course, I think that, the thing about ambition, so the Paris commitments as a system of voluntary ambition. And the idea is to push ambition. It is a bit of a developed country conceit that this is the way forward. It's a developed country conceit because ambition is fine for them, but ambition costs money for developing countries. If the cost of the transition, you have to pay 10% for the money, other people are paying 2, 3, 4% for the money, it is vastly different. And so one of the things that we need to press and started pressing last year, and is the core of Bridgetown, is that ambition without financing is empty. It's meaningless. It's pointless. It's pointless. If all we get out of COP this year is more ambition, in fact, it's almost worse than nothing. Because what happens to developing countries is the so-called voluntary becomes punitive. So you are encouraged to sign up to a voluntary ambition. There's no money, so you can't achieve the ambition. However, you go to the World Bank or someone for a loan, and they say, but you're not in compliance with your NDCs. And we're only providing money for those people in compliance. Suddenly, what appears to be voluntary actually becomes very important to you doing normal things. So I think that the finance bit is really central to development and for developing countries being on board with the green transition, which is essential to preserve the planet. Developing countries have to be on board. So what will we see out of COP? I think one of the things that Prime Minister Mia Mottley will probably say in her opening remarks, and I think will come out of the declaration, is trying to say that there is an emerging climate finance system where we are going to develop mechanisms that do not currently exist to de-risk the flow of money to developing countries. And those mechanisms could include something that we push at Bridgetown, the FX partial guarantee, because the cost of, if you invest in a solar farm in India and you are a British or European investor, you hedge the currency. But the cost of hedging the currency takes away about 7 percentage points of your return straight away. And when you look at your currency hedged rate of return, it's not interesting to you. But a lot of that cost is actually what we in finance call a risk premium. So it actually overcompensates for the risk. It's because people are afraid of risk. They want to be paid more than the actual cost of the risk, the actual risk. They want to be paid more than the actual risk because they're afraid of risk. To encourage them to take the risk, you need to pay them more than the risk. Half of the cost of hedging in developing countries, more than half, is this fear factor, this risk premium factor. So if we can eliminate the fear, so what you're paying for is the actual risk, we could unblock the flow of money. So I think we're going to see in this climate finance system that's emerging is that there's going to be mitigation generates revenues. Let's get the private sector to do it. But for them to come to developing countries, we need new mechanisms to unblock the flow of money. Adaptation is no revenues. There are these private sector zealots who believe the private sector can do everything. The private sector cannot do adaptation. Except in agriculture, in fact, you can get adaptive agriculture, resilient agriculture, but by and large, adaptation means heavy public infrastructure. And so we're going to see as part of this emerging climate finance that adaptation means borrowing money, but you need to borrow low cost long term. And that the development banks need to do that. So you're going to hear this mention of this tripling of MDB lending, which was an India G20 committee result, or there wasn't a agreed result of the G20, Indian G20. They were unable to get people to agree to that. But I think you're going to see more of that repeated. So that's the second layer of this thing. The third layer is the loss and damage fund, which is now being there. The fourth layer is, and you mentioned SDRs. So we have an international financial system which is now facing more and more shocks. And it's climate, and some things climate related. There's a linkage, of course, between climate and pandemics. Pandemics need warmer, wetter climates. And what's climate delivering for us? But warmer, wetter climate. So we're going to have more shocks to the system. Now, we have an international financial system where there's a shock, money rushes to the safe havens, the US and Europe. Those countries are able to respond with good policy. They can cut interest rates and expand their budgets to respond because money is rushing to them. In the developing world, money is rushing away. We have to raise interest rates. We've got to cut spending. The shock actually then becomes amplified and worse in our countries. And so how do we break that? How do we create a more shock absorbing system? Special drawing rights. So special drawing rights are very, very complicated. Very, very few people understand it. The reason why much has not happened is because you say, why don't we do SDRs? And people say, oh, you can't use SDRs for that. Because only very few people in any government there's like one person, they have a very pointy head who's responsible for saying, no, you can't use SDRs for that in every government. But SDRs are basically a right that we give to countries to borrow the central bank reserves of other countries. And you get to borrow their central bank reserves at very low cost. So it's borrowed. It's not free money, but it is that you get an automatic right. You don't need to apply for it. You don't have conditions, and it's low cost. You can borrow at the rate of borrowing per day, and you can roll that over forever. So it's great. We've got $1 trillion of SDRs. It represents about 10% of the central bank reserves in the world. Clearly, you can't have 100%. Right to borrow all the reserves out there. Countries need their reserves. But it could be 20%. So we're pushing a bridge down that we raise the amount of SDRs to say 20%. It gives the system much more ability to deal with shocks. You're having a shock, you employ your SDRs, you stabilize your currency. And the other final thing, which has really got huge traction this year, this has been a year of the pause clause. Wonderfully technical. The pause clause is saying that we should have in every financial instrument a clause which says that if a climate disaster has happened, that your interest payments and your principal payments are suspended for 2 years. Now, this is not charity. They're then added back on later at interest, although not at punitive interest, at the same interest you were paying before. So it's reshuffling your payments and giving borrowing countries who've suffered a crisis breathing space just when they need it most. And this is something that we were somewhat alone in campaigning for, but this year has gathered huge momentum. So the World Bank's announced they're going to put pause clauses in their lending to developing countries. The Inter-American Development Bank has said they'll do the same. The US Export Credit Agency has said they'll do it. The UK has said they'll do it. So I think that's another layer. We make the system more shock absorbing. We unblock private sector money with new mechanisms to reduce the cost of hedging. We triple the MDBs to let them fund resilience. And we have money for a loss and damage fund that will have to come not from budgets, but from new international sources of money, like a methane tax. Maybe 20% of the US IRA's levy on methane leakages should go to the loss and damage fund. Maybe 20% of the revenues of Europe's new carbon border adjustment mechanism should go to the loss and damage fund. And so maybe 20% of a shipping emissions levy or an aviation emissions levy should go to the loss and damage fund. And I think that's the way you're going to get to a fund that's $50 billion a year. But remember, loss and damage, it's not about mitigation. It's not even about adaptation. So we need it, but it doesn't get us any further in terms of preserving the planet and reducing emissions. For that, we need $1 trillion a year, that we need to unblock private money with these new mechanisms to get $1 trillion a year, because $1 trillion a year is more than any government could afford. So it has to be private sector, new mechanisms to get the private sector to go to countries they are afraid to go. The angels don't tread there, they don't want to go there. And we've got to reduce the cost of capital for that, as well as tripling the MDB lending. So I think that's the finance agenda. You're going to see that in the leaders' declaration on the first day of COP. It's going to be signed by a set of prime ministers, of which Prime Minister Motley will be one, and encouraging others to join this emerging climate finance system.
Well, here to that, really. If we're looking at these kind of solutions, and if that is going to be the highlight of the COP, we will look forward to that. And it does, I'm going to do another round of questions. Thanks so much, Professor Prasad, for that. I'm sure our audiences will have many questions related to this, and we'll come back to our audiences. But before that, I'll just quickly go to Vaibhav and Srishran for one last question, one last bit of thoughts that if you could share very shortly, very briefly, if you could talk about, Vaibhav, if you could go back to your, because we were discussing funds and loss and damage fund, and you talked about the operationalization of that. And then you brought in this thing about CBDR. If you could just elaborate a little bit more on that, and then maybe Srishan, if you could go back, we could go back to the energy bit of this, and I'll come back to you on that. So if you could think about it again that.
Sure. So thank you. I think I already talked about the CBDR and historical responsibility principle. They are very important. They are enshrined in the UNFCCC. But increasingly, as we are seeing the the link between the carbon space that every country should ideally have, right? Like based on their development and whatever. So the carbon space we should have, and what we actually have, right? That link is, I think, many people have talked about. The link is financing, right? In the sense, let's say India has the right to emit, let's say, 1,000 gigatons of CO2 for its development need. And because of this climate debate, it's able to emit only maybe 300 because there is a limited carbon budget and all that. Then this 700 tons of CO2 which we are letting go of, right? In some way it should be compensated, right? So that's the finance angle. That's the other, that's not the finance perspective from the operationalization perspective. It's not talking about reducing risk of capital at all. It is from a responsibility and accountability perspective, right? That, okay, this is what you're letting go of, and in some way country should be compensated, right? So I think one of the questions that I also asked in one of the earlier discussion, that India's position on equity is related to carbon space, right? That's how we position equity as, right? Though there are many dimensions of equity, we know that. So from the carbon space perspective, it does appear that the debate will never be equitable, because the overall carbon budget is so limited that is left for the world. And if you look at the emissions of EU, US, also China, even after its 2016 net zero pledge, it is big, like 3 times that of India, very big emissions. So climate debate will probably never be equitable from the carbon space perspective, right? So the question we are asking is, if the climate debate is not equitable, could it still be fair? And that's an interesting question. Could it still be fair in some way? And the way to ensure that it is fair to some degree is to ensure that, well, there's some compensation, and not from compensation from the perspective of, the responsibility, accountability, of which this compensation helps enhancing ambition for the developing world. But it is not at all lack of willingness. It is not at all lack of willingness. It is a lack of some real capability issues about this, the nuts and bolts of enhancing, actions on the ground. The nuts and bolts are clearly missing. We don't have them. So unless we are helped in some way, we can't see progress happening. So all of these debates are kind of squaring off against each other, right? I mean, one is the operationalization perspective, one is the accountability, responsibility, equity perspective, and finance is a very important thread that is kind of running through all of these. And that's why I completely agree with Professor Prasad, if there is some big development happens, right? Because there are also this other perspective which I have heard across many discussions on finance, that this is great messaging, but the World Bank system, even if you triple the financial allocation in that system, it is still going to be a trickle, as compared to the overall finance needs of the developing world across time. So that is what the other perspective is. I am not an expert on to say whether I agree with that or not, but that I have heard other experts talking about this. Right? Not to say it is not important. Every step is important, right? But there have to be many other things probably that needs to be done for ensuring speed and scale. Because those are the two words we are looking for. The direction of the climate debate has clearly changed. Now we are talking about, or we need to think about speed and scale. And that is exactly where finance becomes so kind of absolutely fundamental in the larger equation. And I do hope there is a big development on that front in this COP. Thank you.
Shishan, if you could speak a little bit more, because what Vaibhav is talking about, the discussions on CBDR, but also if if I may go back to what Professor Prasad said, that ambition is something that is held by, that is important maybe to developed nations, and if only higher ambition is what this COP manages, and that is close to nothing. That's a very serious thing to say. But we've also seen very positive events happening. Before this, we've seen China and US sit together, and we saw that earlier when these countries came together, it was good for climate change discussions and action. How optimistic are you given that background? If you could talk a little bit more about that, Rapprochement.
So in terms of optimism, I think both Professor Prasad and Weber both made this point, that for a COP presidency, it's about making the COP a success. and that is typically kind of measured through what ambition has been delivered. So although it might not really amount to anything, concrete in the moment, that also delivers a success. So in that sense, I'm sure that the COP presidency will be able to muster something together to call it success. But whether that is actually equitable in terms of what is delivered, I'm not very optimistic about that. Like Weber mentioned earlier, equity and CBDR both have been slowly eroded to some extent. They still feature very heavily. Like all positions can one form or the other be traced back to how this is interpreted, how these principles are interpreted. But the Paris Agreement itself, brings in a caveat that equity and CBDR come up in light of national circumstances. So it already gives countries like a legal room to say that right now our economy is not doing well, right now we're involved in this war, right now we're so and so, domestic politics does not support it, whatever. And can basically there is an out from the commitments that they would make. Regardless, it is still very important to look at these principles in a forward-looking way. The past, whatever commitments have come through the KP first period, Kyoto Protocol first period, second period, the $100 billion per year commitment, all of these things provide the basis on which any future agreement can be forged. So anything that's not been met in that time frame, there has to be some cognizance of it for a future agreement to be enforceable in any way, or for trust to back a future agreement. And again, like Weber said, it is for India. It has for a long time been about carbon space, having the space to pursue development for the country. And they've, like, after some time where that point was not being made enough, I think in the past few years the Indian government has tried to push it again. It has resulted in this. I think Aarti was mentioning it early on about how we would like to focus on emissions rather than sources. These are all like smaller narrative points that kind of fit to the larger question of carbon space and how you're going to be compensated for foregoing or forfeiting rightful carbon space in some way. Yeah, so in terms of how this debate will take shape this year, like most other things, there's no like simple answer. We can expect that there are going to be more assaults. There are going to be more on these principles. There are going to be more obfuscation, reinterpretations. Wherever in the Paris Agreement, as well as in most articles of the Paris Agreement, most articles that have to do with emission reductions and delivering finance, there is this line that says developed countries shall take the lead. There's a line that comes from the UNFCCC that is still there. Every year it gets interpreted slightly differently. We'll see how this year it goes. I don't know if that answers your question.
On that optimistic note, I'll throw
Can
this.
I just make a very short intervention?
Sure.
Because I'm keen to hear your audience's questions. But I think the debate has actually moved on a little bit from that, what we've just heard, I'm afraid to say. There's going to be no compensation. There's going to be no compensation. Rich countries are hardly compensating their own people. They're cutting their public pensions. They're cutting their social security budgets. They're cutting their anti-poverty programs. They want to do something, some of them, but there's going to be no compensation of the scale that is meaningful. That is why I think we've moved on from that. You've said, okay, we're not going to get compensation. What we need to do is make the financing so cheap that it happens. So we need $2.4 trillion. 1.9 of that is the green transformation, which can be private sector led, but they need guarantees. So we say to people, don't give us compensation of 2.4 trillion or whatever, but help us with these guarantees. Provide these guarantees. These projects make money. These guarantees are probably not going to be very costly to you. We need about $350 billion on resilience, adaptation building. Tripling MDB lending will get you there. MDBs lend $100 billion a year. Tripling MDB lending will get you as close to that 350 billion we need. But we need developed countries to put some capital into the banks. Every $1 they put into the bank, they can get 7 to 10 to maybe sometimes 20 when they do guarantees. So here we're saying, don't give us compensation, but put capital into the development banks that you have a majority shareholding in. If you want to keep a majority shareholding in, make it work. If it's not working, we're not interested in you being a majority shareholder for any longer. That leaves the final bit, the tough bit, loss and damage. And for that, we need emissions taxes, because that's also not coming through compensation or government budgets. I think civil society should argue for it. I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's exactly right. Compensation is owed. Compensation is just. But I'm also in the business of what's going to happen this year, next year. I'm part of a government. Our people are suffering today. So I don't want to sit in an armchair making a great debate on compensation that will never come. I want to get some delivery for them today. And so emissions taxes for loss and damage, development banks for resilience, private sector unlocking guarantees. The rich countries can provide support on all of those things, which will get us where we want to be without them providing $2.4 trillion of compensation, which they're never going to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Prasad. And we are going to look forward to that leader's declaration, which includes many of your points that you've raised today on finance. The floor is open for questions. Please, Nivedita, I'll see.
So you spoke about methane pledges. Do you think climate finance would be hinged to pledges? Because you spoke that some countries would be forced to look inwards about raising their methane ambition. So do you see the linkage?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting question. I think, well, in formats like JETP, it could enter, right? In those formats. I think the general debate on climate finance is not really hinged to anything, because ultimately it's domestic actions, and countries have to, kind of take domestic actions with the help of finance. So in that sense, it is not. But these JETP formats have very clear deliverables. Like coal was one big deliverable. Yeah, I mean, and it depends on the countries, right? For example, South Africa, Indonesia agreed to coal being there. India clearly did not agree. So they can, I mean, in these kinds of format, G7 countries can always try to introduce these things, these clauses as targets. Of course, I don't expect if it comes to India, India would ever agree, at least in the near future. But maybe some other countries might agree to it. So in JETP format, it is a very real possibility of these kinds of things being introduced from now.
It's not a question, but a clarification. Sisan, you mentioned that we shouldn't, and we are not at that position where we should start giving up on any fuel or any source of energy. You also mentioned that whatever we do in terms of other sources, we can't meet the energy demand by restricting a source. And I just want to clear, you mean coal in this context for India. Have you really done the numbers on, even if India abide by its own ambition of increasing for 50 to 500 gigawatt of RE, and looking at the demand which government itself has projected with a slightly increased demand this year? Our numbers say, I'm from Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, and we say that, or we have done calculations where if Indian government abide by installation of RE to the scale that we promised for 2030, and the growth in demand is as planned, or even if it's slightly 0.5% more than that every year, our coal consumption will peak by 2027-28 in the electricity sector. So in such a context, when we make such broad statements of that maybe we as a country are not ready to give up on any fuel, what that leads to, and also we have seen that narrative changing in last year where
Sorry, just to clarify, I didn't mean any source of energy. What I meant was any new technology that is coming up. I didn't mean giving up or reducing the coal in our energy mix, or
so that's what I am saying, it will reduce.
of course it will. Of course it will.
Okay, so that's
There's
because it
no-
was a bit confusing
Right.
to me. I don't know about others. That India right now, last year we have seen change in how India is investing. We have seen restricting finances in coal-based power generation for last few years. This year, a lot of new projects are coming up. A lot of new mines are being opened up, and we can discuss more about it. And that's a very wrong pathway to go for India, where we are locking in huge capital and we are looking in this technology of past, and there needs to be a shift. If we don't do, we are on a
No, absolutely. I did not mean conventional sources of fuel. I meant new technologies that are coming
so
up.
that was the clarification. Thank you.
But let me also respond to that. I think it's not very clear to me, at least, that there are two things. The first larger point is growth is extreme. The growth is extremely important variable to answer that. If you enter a high growth phase, then it will be very challenging for us to limit coal. But if you, of course, the revised growth projections under this new headwinds in the world, whatever is happening in the world, of course, lower growth projection, that means energy demand is lower, and maybe then you don't need to have additional coal till 2030. I mean, we can't say anything about 2035 or later than that, because growth at some point will pick up. The question is, this new additional demand, how comfortable or what will be our position in terms of the technicalities of the grid? And I know Mr. Kumar is here, he's a really expert, so I look forward to listening to him. But our broad analysis, what it clearly says, I don't think India has any love for coal. I don't think so. I think the love is for energy security and reliability. If we find technical solutions, anywhere in the world, nobody has demonstrated this. Technical solutions for such a fast-growing economy. A fast-growing economy, technical solutions, if there are there, then of course, no doubt about it, coal will be limited, it will go down.
It can be a really nice discussion. I would love to discuss it at length with you. But according to government's own numbers, we will peak. If the only condition there is that RE is installed at the pace that we plan to. If that's done, that's the only variable. Growth cannot go from 4.5 to 8%. It can go to 5%. And the coal which is available today, the capacity which is available today, will peak at least in terms of coal consumption for the electricity sector around 2027-28. That's based on government's own projection. That's not my numbers.
Sure.
And we can discuss more.
Yeah, sure. We look forward to the next session on this one, especially.
Yes, hi, my name is Gaurav. I'm from Press Trust of India. My question is for Professor Prasad. Sir, do you think LDF will ever be able to raise enough money to be able to meet the demands, loss and damage demands of all developing countries? Because going by the past experiences, we had adaptation fund, we had green climate fund, we had fund for least developing countries, and they struggled to raise even a few $1 billion. And these options were available then too. The levy on aviation emissions and shipping emissions. Why do you think it will be able to raise enough money to meet LND demands now? And the second, though we have an agreement, a draft agreement on LDF now, but many nations are not happy, especially the US. They say that the language on voluntary contribution is not very clear. Do you think it could reopen at COP? The discussion at loss and damage can reopen at COP? Thank you.
I don't think it'll be reopened at COP. I think America has now come out saying that on reflection, that they are comfortable. And the dangers of reopening it is that we end up with nothing. I think loss and damage is probably around $100 to $150 billion per year today, rising. as we fail to mitigate and adapt at a sufficient pace, to perhaps $300 billion, $350 billion, I think, according to the IPCC, by 2030. So it's a big number, a very big number. The total aid budgets in the entire world, all of the aid budgets spent on everything, is only $200 billion. There's no way they're going to, take half of all the aid budget and put it into a loss and damage fund. So we need new sources of revenues, like new emission taxes. Now, we got some momentum around the shipping levy at the Paris summit. Some 22 countries left Paris in June, pushing for a emissions levy. And then a number of developing countries said, well, China and Latin America in particular, China and Brazil, that the shipping emissions levy is going to disproportionately hurt them because they're further away. They do a lot more shipping than others do with long distances. Seems to me that there could be a way of designing a tax that was not ended up being a tax on remoteness. A shipping levy, $100 per ton of carbon, would raise $60 billion per year. A methane emissions levy, a carbon border adjustment levy, you add those things together, you could get to an $80 billion a year number, which I think would be fantastic. Because as you say, many of the other funds are tiny. Will we get there? Well, I would say that if I was a betting man, I wouldn't bet on it happening next year, but that is what we have to do. That is our task. Our task is to agitate, advocate, elevate this issue, and keep on talking about it. And one of the ways in which we have persuaded the rich countries to sign up to this agreement is by pointing out on the last day when I was trying to get them to agree, I said that if they cannot agree to a loss and damage fund and show some responsibility for loss and damage, then everything else unravels. How can you push developing countries to mitigate faster than they would normally do with their economy? If there was no Paris Agreement, developing countries would not be doing as much emphasis on mitigation. And you can't get them to make that effort because the green transformation for developing countries is going to be faster than anyone has ever done. You can't get them to do that if you say, oh, and I don't care about the past. I don't care about loss and damage. So I think that we will get we will get the fund, we'll get it operationalized, we'll get some initial money, maybe up to $1 billion. And then we have a long task of agitating for new types of emission taxes for which part of the money goes to loss and damage. That is certainly going to be a big part of my work next year. I do not believe it's going to be a short journey.
My question, Professor Prasad, is do you know if the question of expanding donor base is still very tricky for this COP? That's where a lot of the discussion was last year. There are many countries that are still on the hook for that. For instance, China. Is there where it still rests? And my second question is, you talk about giving guarantees and eventually it will reduce the cost and the risk will be less, and therefore theoretically speaking it should happen. Why does it not happen? I mean, the International Solar Alliance, for instance, it's based in Delhi, and it was intergovernmental, and at that time it was set up to raise $1 trillion by 2030, and they work as well a lot in Africa. And if you see their principles and measures that they're taking is also really to work towards bringing the cost of capital down for Africa. But if an intergovernmental alliance like a solar alliance is finding it very hard, then where is it that the rubber will hit the road?
You raised three big questions, and I'm an old man, so I don't know if I can remember them all. I think at COP, this issue of common but differentiated responsibilities and particular capabilities, as the panelists said, it's a very important one, important principle. It is a battleground. But there's geopolitics in your title. There's a lot of geopolitics behind it, because the reality is COP is voluntary. we got these developed countries in our negotiations saying we don't want to be on the hook for loss of. It's like, well, they're not on. They haven't behaved as if they're on the hook for anything. They're not behaved as if they're on the hook for mitigation. They haven't behaved as if they're on the hook for adaptation. So I think the reality is it's a lot of posturing. There is a problem, which is a common but differentiated responsibilities and particular capabilities, has become weaponized in part because we have fossilized the definition of developed and developing in 1992. Now, we could, I think, get us to say, because common but differentiated responsibilities, I think, is a very good compromise principle. We all have responsibilities, but they're different. I think we can get there if we could, why do we object to putting the word evolving in front? Evolving common but differentiated responsibilities and particular capabilities. So that says, look, we all have common responsibilities, they're differentiated, and these differentiations may move over time. I mean, China will have some responsibility over time. China is rapidly eliminating their carbon space. Not there yet, but they are eliminating it rapidly. So at what point do they... Saudi Arabia, defined as a developing country, does not make contributions directly on these issues. So evolving common but differentiated responsibilities, I think, is a solution. Why have we not done these things? Well, I think that if I look at the progress we've made in the last 12 to 18 months, the progress we've made has been about understanding where people are. So we can double the amount the multilateral development banks do simply by them stretching their balance sheets. So that was our first campaign. And there's an agreement this year to expand their lending by $200 billion. That's a lot of money. There was zero last year, $200 billion. Now, it's a long way from where we need to be, but it's a big step. So, and we found that when they started pledging the $200 billion and agreeing to it, they then began saying, maybe we'll put some more capital in. So I think that we have to be very clear-eyed on where we need to go. And I describe what I do as by moving the door handles of doors always and seeing which one's moving, which one's not. Today, stretching the balance sheets of development banks is moving, pause clauses is moving, putting a little bit of capital. Let's push as far as we can with those things and then move on to the next.
Any other questions? Shall I? This was an excellent discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Prasad, Vaibhav, Srishan. Thank you so much to the audience. And hopefully we'll come back and discuss the leaders' declaration and the outcomes of the COP very soon. And we look forward to hearing that. Thank you so much. I'd like to call on my my next set of speakers. Mayank.
Thank you, everyone. That was a very, very rich discussion. Indeed, some very pressing highlights which have come through for this COP28, and I think it's one to watch out for. Moving on to the next session, which is about unpacking where the energy transition and the decarbonization discussion is taking place. If I may invite my esteemed colleague, Mayank Agrawal over here, and our panelists here. So Mr. Alok Kumar is here, who's the former Secretary of the Power Ministry. Thank you so much for being here, sir. Mr. R.R. Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow at TERI. Thank you so much, Rashmi sir. Our third speaker, Mr. Pankaj Satija, who's the Managing Director, Tata Steel Mining and Chairman, Skill Council for Mining Sector, is expected to join online. He is in a meeting, so we're hoping he can make it. Mayank, over to you.
Thanks, Archana. Thanks everyone for setting the context, and I can just hit the ground running. We have had a lot of discussions about energy finance. We have discussed all the issues about COP. So let me just come straight to the question, sir. There are a lot of ifs. Sunil also talked about, big if that the capacity brings. But at the end of it, the basic question that comes every time is energy security and energy independence. You were, you had a, should I say, a sea of thorns or a bed of roses that you can decide, but you had a very eventful 2.5 years as a power secretary. When we are talking about energy security, when we are talking about energy independence, we have seen that when it comes to conflict, everyone finally, whether it is about gas, some countries go for gas, some countries have oil as their energy security. India has more or less right now coal. In that context, when there is a lot of conversation about fossil fuel phase down or phase out, whatever we prefer, how much is the space that India has when we talk about international conferences, climate summits? How much space is there for us to maneuver that space, considering we are still reliant on coal?
Thank you, Mayank. See, this debate of coal phase down or phase out has been there for many years, and I think around 3 years back we yielded to coal being brought in, so we can't go back. But this will come back again and we have been pushing for phase down or phase out of all fossil fuels, which we had yielded, I don't know why and in what circumstances, but others are very, very upfront. They say, no way we can agree to phase out of the phase down of the gas. So this is the India situation. Let me tell you, my understanding is we have not been very aggressive on demanding climate finance for our energy transition. I've been in the meetings and all, when we say, okay, this may be required for global south or for, but when it comes to India, we have not been aggressive. Let me tell you 3 aspects for this coal business in power sector of India. First is meeting the demand. A few minutes ago, you were saying that it will be almost criminal to lock in into coal-based capacities and all. When you are sitting now, you have to plan for 2030, not for 24 or 25. And if you don't plan, the people will not forgive you if there are blackouts in India. And because these projects are long gestation projects, all of us know the track record of the nuclear or hydro. You can't depend on them. They may come after 5 years, they may come after 10 years. How to meet demand? Yes, I agree that renewable, we should do better, and there's a need to do better because even in the present power system scenario, there is scope of absorbing lot more of renewable. Last year in January, we could have absorbed 50,000 megawatt more of solar very easily in the system given. So if we accelerate renewable, it's all right. Beyond a point, there are 2 issues which will come up. They have started coming up. First issue is it technical feasibility? Without storage, you can't handle it. And this issue takes us to affordability. The way our politics is after free power for 200 units, 300 units, affordability is an issue writing on the wall. You can't, sitting here in Habitat Center or somewhere in COP, when you come back from COP, you can't ignore that affordability issue. And there are hidden unhidden cost of integrating renewable energy. You are waiving the transmission charges just for making it feasible to transport at 250, but there are transmission costs which you are pooling and then burdening the states. So the India's reality is on three aspects. First, we should accelerate renewable energy, but beyond a point, you will hit the wall of affordability because of the high storage costs. So we should be very, very aggressive in demanding the climate finance, money for our green energy corridors. Otherwise, India will not be able to phase down or phase out coal. Because my fear is that if the government is not sure how to meet peak, they will set up new coal plants. Nobody can stop. Nobody will be able to stop. So it is the crisis we have to tell the world very clearly, okay, if you want this no coal capacities, come on, the climate finance has to flow in for the VGF or for the green energy corridors. This is the main point which India should raise at COP. Second is this affordability, and third, which we have not raised very aggressively, is the supply chain of critical minerals and the import dependability. It is very fashionable to talk of battery storage and for all this solar polysilicon and the green hydrogen electrolyzers, but all of them need critical minerals. They need CRGO, they need HVDC equipments. They're not available. So we have not been very, very clear and aggressive, okay, that this transition is just not feasible technologically because the material is not just available. If it is available, then we will become highly dependent. We are dependent today for oil and gas. Tomorrow we will be dependent for the critical minerals. So in my view, India's position is we should accelerate renewable energy as fast as we can. Beyond a point, we need to have climate finance for the green energy corridor and VGF. And for the we should talk more of supply chains of the critical minerals and the critical material around the transition. For timing, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, sir. I just want to take that conversation ahead from there because as we are saying about if there are ifs about technology, there are ifs about finance, there is also if about critical minerals.
My technology is available. Let us not club technology and finance. In whole of the G20 working group meeting which I chaired, the technology is not with the government. They say if it is commercially agreed and voluntarily, this whole talk of technology is not, in my mind, it is not relevant. Important is the cost. Technology at what cost? Carbon capture at what cost? Cost is important. So there will be natural progression of the cost reduction of technology that you can't predict. You can accelerate it. So let us talk of finance. Technology is not a relevant issue because it's not with the government. They can't give it.
Sure. What I want to just now focus on taking that if, I want to focus on that if, whether it is a renewable capacity finance or whether it is about even the critical mineral cooperation. How much space do you think that there is? Because we keep talking about finance, we keep talking about cooperation, but we don't see enough action on the ground. Do you see space for India on that?
I'll say India will go its own feasible pace. Accelerate RE, yes, but beyond a point, we will take time till the storage costs are bearable. Or we can have money for green energy corridors. This path of waiving transportation charges is not practical when you go from 10 megawatt or 10 gigawatt to 100 gigawatt. It is just not feasible. So I'll say the pace will be decided whenever they talk of fastening or accelerating the coal phase out. We should talk of the finance and the critical minerals. Otherwise, India is doing more than it ought to do and more than it can do. That is my sense.
Thank you. I'll come back to the capacity part. Rashmi sir, I want to come to you. You both are veterans. But I want to understand about this international cooperation bit that we want, that whenever we talk about, there is this model of JETP that we discussed in the last panel. People have been talking about JETP and whether it is good or bad, it's still to be seen. But in the Indian context, is there a space for JETP? Like, is there a space for India to accept the JETP models that are being pushed at this moment?
Well, thank you for raising this question once again. I was listening to the discussion in the previous panel. The answer was given partly by Vaibhav and some others. You see, the idea behind JETP, you have to understand how it originated. There is a model of global climate financing set up under the UNFCCC. That hasn't worked. The money is not flowing. Therefore, and all the donors, all the contributors they want to establish that they are still committed to financing the climate actions in the rest of the world. So they are going their own pace through independent channels. So JETP is actually, I would say, a disintegration of the current climate financing architecture. So it is driven by the personal, individual ambition of the donor country. Now that doesn't match with the interests of the recipient or the country which is expected to implement a climate action. In a country like India, our interests are completely different from what some other country might be willing to do or might be willing to receive climate finance. So JETP is good. I mean, after all, you cannot rule out or you need not unnecessarily create barriers to flow of funds from any channel as long as it is coming at the terms which suit your interests. But I don't see that happening at this moment. So therefore, there are still problems. The JETP is welcome as a climate financing model as an international instrument, but we have to see how it is going to serve the interests of the recipient country. That dialogue is not happening at all.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, I want to come back to you on this. We were talking about the capacity part. We were supposed to touch 175 gigawatt of renewable by 2022. We are talking about Sunil talked about 450 gigawatt by 2030, which is a big if for coal to stagnate or the coal not to increase. We have a target of 1.5 billion tons of coal. These all are numbers, but we also have seen that there is not enough finance. Even if the finance is increasing for renewables, we are still halfway of what we need to ensure that we reach 450 gigawatt of renewables by 2030. So whether we look at JETP, whether we look at international finance mechanisms, whether we look at low cost finance, how do we see that progress?
See, the two aspects. The progress of addition of new RE capacities has been slow in my understanding, mainly because of our desire to localize the manufacturing first. Because we were not in a position to accept a situation where we import everything from China or some other country and we set up the solar power plants, and we, as I've been saying, we export all our green jobs to China. So there was a desire, and it's a very legitimate desire, legitimate objective to localize manufacturing. I think there are now good progress of localization, and that local manufacturing is happening now. They're being set up, and we'll pick it up. That is one. Second, for the RA projects as such, the finance is not going to be a problem, because our track record of, say, the transparent bidding and now the payment discipline is quite attractive to the investors. Issue would come in the fallout of the cost of that integration. I'm saying the transmission lines, balancing costs, storage costs. So we need the climate finance and the soft funding for those components, not for solar power plants. That is my understanding.
In fact, I remember a lot of your work was around hydro and also about transmission.
No, we have set up this first 1000 megawatt hour of the battery storage we did by the Power System Development Fund, because we were not prepared to wait for the whole Government of India system to give us VGF. So we did as a pilot, so let it go. So templates has been laid out, it's successfully auctioned. Now we have to scale it up. But the Government of India, they have given VGF now sanctioned for 4000 megawatt hour. Is it good enough? I don't think so. We need more money. And at the sake of repetition, if you need 2.5 lakh crore of funds for building transmission line for a 500 gigawatt, who will bear the transmission cost? So these lines are used for 20% time, 30% time, only 30% utilization. Again, waiver is not a solution. You need to grant fund these lines if you have to absorb this integration. So that is the core issue.
Understandable, absolutely understandable. Rashmi sir, I wanted to come to you. We have been talking about renewables, we have talked about coal phase out, phase down. Another area of conversation that has repeatedly found a lot of space is decarbonization of the whole industrial sector. Do you think that in this COP we have a lot of people are calling this COP a corporate COP also. Do you think that there is a space for decarbonization of industrial sector being a centerpiece of conversation this year?
Well, so this is important area of discussion, no doubt, but I don't know whether this discussion will take place at the global level and whether that is an appropriate forum for discussion, because this is a part of the national strategy. National development strategy, looking at different sectors, their specific roles, the pace at which they can transform themselves. I don't know whether this can be discussed at the global level at all. So certainly there will be discussion. There is a mitigation work program going on, and that mitigation program is looking at the pace of mitigation. But I don't know whether a sectoral targets or sectoral transformation strategy will be discussed at the global level. And I certainly don't believe that this will be efficient, either in terms of negotiations or either in terms of actual objectives. So while it is important to look at the abatement in the industrial sector, that clearly needs to be discussed by amongst ourselves, and we have to be clear about what we can do. To me, it appears that the industrial decarbonization is a tough nut to crack. We are still not, you are hearing from the horse's mouth. Even the renewable energy is such a difficult area to, where you can't achieve the objectives so easily. You have there are barriers, there are a number of issues there. So industrial decarbonization, where you don't have alternative sources of energy, even technology is under question. Here there are areas where technology is available. It's a question of cost of financing. But in the industrial decarbonization, it's not just the cost, it's also the alternative technologies. Even those are not available. They have to be developed, you have to innovate. So that takes time. So there is no time frame for these things in the global transformation, the systemic transformation, which the IPC is now talking about, the global GST technical dialogue has talked about. These are all wishful thinking. At least as far as the industrial decarbonization is concerned, this is certainly a desired thing to happen. Obviously, without decarbonizing the industries in the long run, you can't achieve the net zero goal. No country can do that. Even in our own country, we have the industries contribute almost 30% of the emissions, perhaps more than that. So that will be, but that will be the residual sector. You can't put it up front and start transforming them right away. In fact, the modeling studies that we have done in TERI, they said that despite whatever you might be able to do, even if you are able to transform the entire power sector and bring it down to, let's say, nearly zero in terms of emissions, industrial emissions will still be there. They will, and almost 3 billion tons of emissions will be left in our system when we reach 2050 or 2040. And at that time, our total emissions will be in the range of 6 to 7 billion tons. So 3 billion tons out of 6 billion tons is a hell of a lot of amount. And that is happening only because you don't have access to new technologies, apart from the major barrier in terms of lack of finance.
On industrial, maybe we may not have the top level decision, the cover page, the cover decision, but my sense is there have been a lot of good work has been done on industrial sector in the G20 presidency of India. Those two issues would be taken up. Let us see the progress. India was proposing the roadmap for doubling the pace of energy efficiency. It was not supported by some other countries. India was lead because we have done exceedingly well in the energy efficiency industries in the PAT program. That can be taken forward. IEA is fully supported. Second aspect is the green hydrogen, the harmonized international standards for trade. I think that work should come up in some committees or somewhere, because we should not take only COP28 top 3 decisions which are make the media headlines. There is a lot of legwork, a lot of committees they work. I think this COP28, a lot of committees will take up these two issues: the doubling the pace of energy efficiency and the common international standards for defining the low emission hydrogen. My sense.
Thank you for touching upon the green hydrogen part. Actually, I wanted to ask next about green hydrogen only. We have been talking about green hydrogen and we have been focusing whether from the private or from the government sector. Even the steel sector is talking about adopting green hydrogen to come up with green steel with all CBAM and everything kicking in. How feasible is a solution like green hydrogen when we are talking about, especially in this context, how feasible the green hydrogen solution is right now?
Green hydrogen is a futuristic intervention for India, which will scale up on large scale in the next decade. This decade is a challenge for some scaling up and bring down the cost. There are two major aspects in green hydrogen. One, India has been hoping to tap the export demand. My sense is there are very strong competitors to Indian green hydrogen, like Australia or some other countries, and they have already moved ahead. India would have to depend largely on the domestic demand creation. So there was already an Energy Conservation Act was amended that you can impose obligations. So government will have to take a call that to the extent industries can afford the additional cost, some obligations should come. If you have a domestic demand, I think India can become a leader in green hydrogen. It's first one aspect. Second important aspect is the electrolyzer manufacturing. Type of incentives which are being offered by the Inflation Reduction Act and by European Union, I am still not very sure whether India would be able to offer those type of incentives to have the local electrolyzer manufacturing, number one. Number two, both material wise as well as technology wise, half the part of electrolyzer is the stack. On stack, I think we are still a beginner, and we can't build a green hydrogen ecosystem in India without having substantial progress in sight of local manufacturing of electrolyzer. What has happened in solar the last 5-6 years? So there are two questions which India has to decide: creating local demand and giving incentives, adequate incentives to attract the manufacturers for electrolyzer stack part. BOP, we are leaders. The balance of part, balance of plant, we can manufacture. I've gone and seen the factories. So these two things, but let me say, my understanding, India has very strong competitive strengths to become a green hydrogen leader. Government will have to decide whether they can resolve these two issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I ask audience of their questions, Rashmi sir, I wanted to ask you one more thing. There is a lot of pushback from climate campaigners as far as technologies like CCUS is concerned, while energy companies are, making a huge case for it. In how much space do you think that there is for a solution like CCUS? And considering the scope and what happens, do you think that there can be an outcome specifically related to solutions like CCUS?
Well, I'm not the best person to answer from a technical point of view, but looking at the COP dynamics, my own sense is that UAE is the current presidency. UAE is a major oil producer, and if there is a pressure on them to show some demonstrable, deliverable, perhaps they will fall for it. I'm not sure to what extent this will gain traction, but I think there will be some emphasis there, and for them it is an easy option. For a country like UAE, for the major oil producers, this might be something with which they can show to the world that, look, this is what we have done for the rest of the humanity. So they might, so this is one dimension which might be, you may be, you have to watch out for this space. But this is just a political messaging. In terms of actual impact on the emissions trajectory, I don't think it's going to make any impact at all. The energy demand everywhere is going to grow. The current fossil fuel consumption is also growing. And it's, I think, unless we come up with really effective solutions, but for economies like India, where we are grappling with several other access issues and source issues, this is obviously a distraction. But for the petroleum industry, I believe, I mean, they are seriously engaged in this discussion. So I'm sure they would like to look at this option because they have a business model where they might be able to profit from it and use it also as a part of their strategy. But that has a limited role in our economy. Beyond that, I think it's just a political messaging.
Thank you so much, sir. Are there any questions from the audience? Nivedita?
Good evening. My question is very basic because I have two power sector veterans here. India has been harping on coal, saying we need aspirational demands to be met. Given the other sectors where we see miscalculated either DPRs or in case of environment, EIAs and all such reports that are made or projections that are made. One very basic example I immediately remember is of a metro ridership report which projected something and the 5 years data was surpassed in 6 months of ridership. So given all such track record that we have, how robust are our estimations for power need? Are those calculations right? What I fear is, do we have a possibility where we'll exceed it the moment we have better energy reach and technology?
So before you take that question up, I also wanted to add, this year, according to the reports, I still don't have the exact numbers. According to the reports, the increase in power demand was only able to was met only because the government had apparently asked coal producers to go full steam ahead. Just wanted to add, as far as the estimations part is concerned.
See, there have been instances, what she's saying, of some predictions going wrong, but if you see the National Electricity Plan, which is on the website of Central Electricity Authority, my understanding it is very balanced and that much demand will materialize. What happens when there are spikes, there is some little bit of, say, loss of confidence or nervousness, so they suddenly announce something and take decision. And let us not go by month-wise, because month-wise our seasons are changing. Say, as far as energy is, power energy is concerned, like electricity energy is concerned, the growth would be in the range of 6 to 7% on annual basis, not more than that, because there will be some plus minus here and there. The biggest challenge which is coming is the now greater uncertainty in demand. You have a pattern in power sector to meet. You operate all power plants during summer and then say, traditionally monsoon is a low demand, so I will open up my power plants for annual maintenance. This time they were caught in September, peak demand. So he may be very unhappy, the person about the coal. What happened to the decision takers, that these type of things which happen, they create a sense of little panic, or say what will happen after 6 years if this is the situation. So you may end up having certain more capacity, because these things are uncertain, nobody can predict. But give and take, in a situation of, for a country like India, we are a growing country. You may have some excess capacity for 2-3 years, but subsequently it will be utilized. So I personally feel, let us make her on the positive side, have some little more capacity, so that we are not facing situation of blackouts in India like Sri Lanka or Pakistan. That is my take.
We basically come back to the question of energy security.
Energy security, energy reliability, they are interrelated concepts. This is more of reliability and meeting the demand. Energy security is more because of your international aspects and your imports and all. This is more of having sufficient capacity for your reliability of supply. Technically, it is, in my understanding, energy security is something like you import oil, you import so much of coal, you import panels, and all. Those are the, I think, long-term, more strategic aspects. This is basically having sufficient capacity to have this supply reliability. The supply will not be reliable.
Sunil.
Sir, I completely agree with having slot for excess capacity than the requirement. But then I'll go to, so you also mentioned that we need more financing for the grid infrastructure improvement rather than support for building a RE plant or a coal plant or whatever. But what we have seen in past, because we invest in so many or so much capacity for coal-based power plants, we recently had 34 gigawatt of stranded assets. A lot of them have been re-auctioned or reallotted or been resolved at very high haircuts, ranging to 80% as well. There were multiple power plants which went at 40% or 50% haircut. So that money, which was basically the public bank's money, and if 35 gigawatt or 40 gigawatt at the cost of 8 rupees megawatt, or the total cost will be around 2.4 lakh crore. If 50% of that went as haircuts, which is taken by the public sector banks or public sector companies, if that money could have been better utilized to modernize the grid infrastructure, that would have been a better use of that. Now, in terms of bad planning, whenever we do bad planning, we end up with such situations. Now, coming to the confidence or the panic situation, whenever we are in panic situation, we end up taking some wrong decisions, and then particularly for the power sector, they might plague us for next 20 years. So in such a scenario, we end up going back to one source which we have tried and tested for last 30 years and we have most confidence on. The same kind of confidence can also be gained if we invest in the technology of future, which is renewable energy. And also we know for a fact that the transmission costs are increasing, mainly because initially when solar came in, it was seen as a rooftop solar kind of program where the generation will be at the load centers. Now we are seeing South Delhi grid is building a battery storage at load center. So those kind of solutions, if are explored at larger scale with showing more confidence from the government side, utilizing the available money even from private financing or the banks or government companies in those kind of infrastructures, will that increase the confidence of the power generators, of the power ministry, and will that lead to us not making slightly long-term wrong decisions in panic situations? Like what would you?
Yeah, actually, let me try to explain once again. Issue is how to meet the peaking load. Issue is very simple. It is not financial modeling. What you are saying may be correct, but country has to be prepared to meet the peaking load. So there are 4 or 5 type of solutions with us. Apart from coal, one is the gas. Gas, you know what has happened to our power plants. There is a possibility of reviving those. I've been a strong votery that there should be a national program for making these 25,000 megawatt of gas-based plants operational first for peaking load and socializing the cost before making any new coal-based plant. Point given. Beyond these gas-based plants, what are the options? Nuclear, you can't depend. You see the track record of our execution, also for the technology dependent on outside. Hydro, we have been pushing, but you know the type of forces, conflicts, and the difficulties you have. So nuclear you can't depend, hydro you can't depend, gas I have already considered. Then you have 2 more solutions: battery storage or the CSP. Battery storage has 2 problems: high cost and import dependence. I have been saying on several occasions, India must go aggressively for the concentrated solar power. So my solution is Either we decide that we take a bold decision to socialize the cost of these gas-based plants and make them operational. Their peaking support for 40, 50 days in a year is not going to be much, I'll tell you. I've done the computations. CSP we have left because solar PV was so exciting and everything, but we should go back to CSP because the homegrown solution for storage, RE for storage, is a God gift. We should go for it. But unless until you make a commitment for gas or CSP, I don't see as a power professional any other solution except coal in India for peaking capacity. 1 minute. Private sector will not come for coal now, neither for gas. Take my word. That's why government is doing all coal in the government's companies for the sake of being confident that after 6 years I will have peaking capacity. You need to have peaking capacity, partner. This funding 50% here, this doesn't work. Country needs solid physical capacity right here to serve the need, serve the load.
No, I definitely agree with most of the points you made. One, that this year, after a long gap, we have seen private players coming up with proposals for new coal-based power plants. It has started.
Let us see, they are mostly a captive partner, I'm telling you.
Okay.
Whatever they are buying in NCLT, so I think that this will become not COP, become an Indian power sector. I don't want to that. They are doing it for their captive, for making their solar manufacturing or their green, or supporting some of their production plants. Nobody from private sector will invest in a coal-based plant or supply to DISCOMs. It's gone.
We'll come to this conversation later. We'll come
no,
to
I
this.
needed a slight more.
Sunil, we'll just finish this and we'll come to it. Just over the coffee.
It's about 500 gigawatt of RE.
We'll just come to it. Once we finish, we'll come to it. Thank you so much, Sunil. Is there any other question, Arti?
Yes.
Gaurav.
So since many countries are now increasingly talking about capturing emissions and not phasing down fossil fuel or phasing out fossil fuels, and there are voices in India that support this, and G20 leaders declaration also captured it in terms of CCUS technology. I just wanted to know whether India should invest heavily in R&D, CCUS R&D, because ultimately any country which cracks this technology will take lead in climate action and business.
In my understanding, CCUS in India is not widely relevant because it is relevant for those countries who will produce blue hydrogen from natural gas. And they're doing it. Australia is doing it. Many countries do it. For India, CCUS has some potential for oil industry and cement industry. The cement is still, there is no other technology except what you burn coal in the clinkers. So my sense is that public funds, large public funds for R&D for CCUS for India doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. It should be done for mostly for cement industry and for oil industry. We should invest more on green hydrogen. CCUS is for those who will do blue hydrogen. We are so strong in solar, we should put all our efforts and money behind green hydrogen. Don't distribute your money, R&D money in 10 places. It will not work.
Arti?
Well, I can ask my question. I just wanted to ask Rashmi sir, sir, since 2 years, that whole discussion on new collective quantified goal, we didn't hear of that this time. Is it still an alive creature? Will it be linked to what will happen at the GST, or is it as fuzzy as ever?
I think we are still 3 years away from there. Well, the first the challenge is to get this discussion going. Right now, the discussion is on the loss and damage fund. So, how to fund the loss and damage issue? Only after that, the new and collective goal can really acquire some kind of a shape. Of course, the issue will be there on the table as far as I understand. But you obviously can't get an agreement on this. You heard Professor Prasad that the restructuring of the climate finance system that is still being attempted. to bring private sector in, the new kinds of instruments, new platforms that are being discussed. Only then, there will be some clarity. We have the broad numbers. The broad numbers are there in the G20 statement also. But that's not neither here and there, because it's not a commitment of somebody to provide that kind of resource to you. That has to be mobilized. The instruments have to be finalized. I am certainly, since you have raised this question and I hold the mic, so I'll take the privilege of responding to you. I have my own reservations about some of the instruments which Professor Prasad was suggesting, because those are explosive issues. See, the point is that. No, all kinds of things. Any kind of emission levy at the global level, of whether you take methane or aviation or shipping, any sector that you take and impose a tax on that at a global level, the very idea of a global tax is an anathema to many countries. Do you think US will agree to that? So the question is, you have to look at the global, the feasibility and the desirability, and also the necessity of it at times. In fact, the necessity is also being overlooked. It's not necessary that these taxes will actually be effective and serve your purpose. But be that as it may, the question is that since a fund has to be financed, fund has to be fed, they have to look at some sources of funds. This question was debated at length when the Transition Committee for Green Climate Fund was meeting, and I was a part of that. It never went anywhere. It ultimately had to rely on the contribution of the donors, and most likely that is going to be the solution, at least to begin with. But that discussion is still going to take a very long time.
Thank you. We have the last question.
Yes, sorry. Good evening. My name is Tanya. This is a follow-up question to your reply on CCUS. You said it's not relevant to India. I know Mr. Satija did not make it today, but I know Tata Steel did a CCUS pilot at, I think in Orissa. Just wondering if you know, they did it 2 years ago. They've stayed silent about how it's going since then, and they haven't officially talked about it. So I was wondering if you know about this pilot and whether
aware of
it's successful.
Odisha thing. I'm aware of their NTPC has done some carbon capture in Vindhyachal for making green methanol. So I'm not ruling out. I did not say, he says major R&D. So I'm not saying it is not relevant. Maybe after 10 years, 20 years, we are sitting here, CCUS. But in the current scenario, CCUS is relevant more for those countries who will produce the blue hydrogen from natural gas. We are strong in green hydrogen. So it is not a priority for India in that context.
Because Niti Aayog also had a...
No, I have a high regard for Dr. Saraswat, don't tell him. And if he listens, that's because he is... But if you ask my opinion, I will say what my understanding is. CCUS, say there are two aspects. If it's taking time, I'll take 1 minute. One is the cost, another is storage. Say cost is 2.5 rupee. And you burn more coal because you increase your auxiliary consumption of a power plant.
Yeah,
What we're talking about, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, once you capture that carbon dioxide, what will you do with it? You can do only 5-6% for the green products. Where will you store? In India, do you have land? We are such a populated country, heavily populated country. Other country might have long deserts and much areas to dig into the aquifers and seabed. You are not able to set up a nuclear power plant or hydropower plant. Would you store liquefied carbon dioxide in the earth in India? Just think of it. So it is on a very large scale, with the present technology and costs, it is not very relevant for general in India.
So
for cement and
unofficially, it's not on the radar for the government anymore. Because I know end of
I
last
can't say
year
on the radar and being highly relevant is very different things. So sorry, don't misread that. What I'm saying, it is relevant, you might do it, but our focus should be on green hydrogen for R&D. Yeah.
I'm sure we can have a very engaging tea and coffee session. I have a couple of questions, but then...
Okay, please. All right, okay. Okay, I'll ask very quickly. Mr. Kumar, you talked about localization of solar PV manufacturing. To what extent is it really localization at the chip level, and to what extent is it assembly at the moment? In which direction are we moving and how quickly?
Is there any more question? Then we can have all of them together.
Information which I have in public domain, a substantial around 20 or 25 gigawatt of capacity by the PLI scheme by MNRE is to the integrated plant. It will be from wafer to modules. So now there is substantial movement to deeper localization, but still polysilicon is a problem because that needs a much bigger plant. So for that we are dependent on exports, but after the polysilicon you make the ingots and wafer and cells. I think from then, I think sizable capacity will come in India in next 2-3 years. My information.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the lovely, engaging discussion. Thank you so much, Gunjan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayank, and thank you to our esteemed panelists, Mr. Alok Kumar and Mr. R.R. Rashmi. This was a very engaging discussion overall. I can't speak for everyone, but for myself, I think I understood a thing or two about what to expect at this COP. I think first and foremost, this is the COP where the global stocktake is going to happen. I think that's something which everybody here should just kind of keep track of on how the entire evaluation process is taking place and where the ambition needs to be ratcheted. I think, and then of course, coming back to what Professor Prasad was saying, that ultimately ambition is only going to increase or be able to keep track if there is finance. So clearly, I mean, the finance solutions which have been provided by solutions like the Bridge Down Agenda, or going forward, whether we can have further ambitions like tripling of MDB reforms. I think those are things which we'll see how they unfold. But clearly, some of the low-hanging fruits which might be expected are definitely the loss and damage fund. If that can be operationalized, would definitely be a victory to show for at COP28. And while the G20 did underline the tripling of RE, how maybe we can push for and give that a leverage at the COP28 to show that as something which can be an increase on ambition. I think definitely some of those things to be kept in mind: methane, nuclear. Definitely things which will lead to a lot of tussle. Who is going to pay will always be the big elephant in the room, the biggest elephant in the room. And I think apart from that, of course, looking down internally, like in this session, I think some very important points made by both our speakers here about looking at about how India maybe needs to look better at finance and how it's going to scale up its grid infrastructure, and also look at supply chain issues and where it can kind of build capacity to scale up on green hydrogen in the domestic arena. I think some very crucial points to kind of keep an eye out for. Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists in both the sessions and to our very engaged audience. Thank you for joining, those who joined online as well as here with us physically. Thank you for being here today. Please join us for some tea and snacks here, and look forward to an exciting COP28 very soon. Thank you.